Okay, great. So our speaker today is Alec Christie. Alec got his PhD in zoology at Cambridge and is now a postdoc working with the CCI, the Conservation Institute, on conservation evidence. He's going to talk about today. He's also a Henslow Fellow, which is an exceedingly difficult fellowship to get. So congratulations, and I think we're in for a treat. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, it's been great to hear about what you're working on here as well. It's really interesting group. Must be great to be part of, to learn about so many different projects that people are doing. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that I've recently been involved with called, which is part of a wider AI at CAM project, which is called AI for Climate and Nature. Oh, sorry, losing my voice. What I'm going to talk about today is a specific part of that wider project, which is all about AI-assisted evidence synthesis for conservation. And so this is, I'm part of a group called Conservation Evidence in Zoology, which I'm going to talk about a bit, and that's based in the David Attenborough building. And I've been working with Anil and Sadiq as well from here to advance this part of the this wider project. So I'll talk a bit about what we've been doing there as well. But the talk is kind of mainly divided into two parts. There we go. So the first part is just going to introduce you to what conservation evidence is. So some context behind what this project is. And then I'm going to talk about basically how we're going to build AI into this, to particularly large language models, to accelerate the processes that we're using to do evidence synthesis and conservation. But more on that in a bit. So first of all, I'll talk a bit about conservation evidence and kind of first just a bit of the rationale behind what this project's doing. So in conservation, we're in a crisis discipline. So our objective is to, many people disagree, I guess, on what the objective of conservation should be, but generally people want to save biodiversity. We want to stop species going extinct, save ecosystems from threats. But one big issue that's been found in this field is that, and this is a quote from Bill Sutherland, who is quite a big name in conservation, who was my PhD supervisor and is involved in this project too, is that generally people that are doing conservation don't use a lot of scientific evidence, or at least historically they haven't. So there were some studies done in around sort of the early 2000s that showed that a lot of conservation managers were mainly relying on personal experience, anecdotes, and the advice of colleagues to inform what conservation actions they were doing. And that's fine. It's fine to use that kind of, that is useful knowledge. But by not looking at wider scientific evidence, people are missing out on learning from other knowledge that's out there in the world that could really help inform what they do. But also looking at very rigorous studies that have really tested this using, for example, counterfactual designs, using controls, understanding what the real impact has been of a conservation study. So we've got kind of an evidence crisis in conservation. We need to try and boost this use of scientific evidence to support decision making. And this is kind of the project, the conservation evidence project is kind of taking inspiration from other fields. So there are lots of fields that are actually much more mature, I guess, in how evidence-based they are, or the approaches they use. So two examples that are often used are aviation, specifically, plane safety, and also medicine. So, for example, in aviation, there are very rigorous processes and protocols that are used to ensure that planes are, checked regularly for safety issues, that those safety issues are identified, and then go through a process of, recalling planes. And there's often news stories about that around windows flying out of planes and all sorts of things going on. But actually, the aviation sector is one of the safest, I think it is probably the safest transport sector in the world in terms of, and I think that's probably a good reason behind that, is because they use such evidence-based approaches to making sure safety is really to a really high standard. The same as in medicine. So there's, you'd hope, and this is usually what goes on in medicine is that recommended treatment is treatments that you're given and the recommendations you're given should always be based on evidence, and ideally these are from randomized controlled trials. And so there's this culture, I guess, this ingrained culture that evidence needs to be used to back up decisions. And that's just something that we're lacking in conservation. And that's part of what the Conservation Evidence Project is trying to do, is bring this culture of evidence use and evidence-based practice to this field. But also, you know, a big part of that is actually doing the synthesis of evidence, bringing all the evidence together. And that's also something this field kind of struggles from, is bringing such diverse data, information together to actually form this evidence base. So that can be another big problem, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that's kind of what the Conservation Evidence Project is trying to do here. So culture of evidence use and trying to synthesize evidence. And to explain a bit more about what we're actually doing, how we're actually collecting that evidence, I just want to quickly show you, many of you might know about this already, but typically when we do evidence synthesis and we talk about this, a systematic review, for example, will have a very set protocol. And this usually involves, coming up with a specific research question that usually uses a format like PICO or something like that. So population intervention, comparator outcome, or some variation of that. Then you go out and search the literature using a standardized protocol very rigorously. You look at, you have some inclusion criteria of which studies you're going to include, which ones you exclude. And then you do some critical appraisal and you write up your review of evidence. And that's generally how most systematic reviews are formulated. So a very specific focused question. But what we do at Conservation Evidence is something a bit different. So rather than having this narrow approach, we have a much more global approach, I guess, to synthesizing evidence. So what we do is we aim to synthesize the global evidence for the effects of conservation actions on biodiversity. So not for a specific question, we're not interested in specifically does, for example, on this slide, we had, it might be how effective are herbicides for managing Japanese knotweed. We take a much more broad approach and look at conservation actions in general. And so what we call our approach, which is an alternative to systematic review, is a different systematic approach called subject-wide evidence synthesis. And so what we do here is we say, okay, we're just interested in any study that quantitatively tests a conservation action. Doesn't matter what kind of action, as long as it quantitatively tests it, we're interested in it. And so what we do is we identify all the journals that are likely to be relevant. So these are core journals and specialist journals in conservation, but also we look at broader, wider journals as well that publish lots of different studies. And what we do is we say, okay, this journal published studies from between these dates. We're going to go through every single volume and issue of that journal and look at every single study and deem whether it's relevant or not for this question, whether it's quantitatively testing conservation action. So rather than doing keyword searches, we just go through everything systematically. And so what we do is we might go to this journal and this issue in this year. We look at the first study, we decide, okay, this is relevant, it tests an action on birds and also to do with forests, so we put it in birds in the forest folder, move to the next one, that didn't test an action quantitatively, we move to the next one, well, that's tested something on elephants, move to the next one, something on butterflies. So we go through, and the whole idea of this is that you never ever need to go back. If once you've gone through a journal, because as long as it's within this remit, this broad remit, we should have, we don't need to do a separate search for a different question. And so what we do is once you've amassed that big database, so this subject-wide database of all the studies that are testing conservation action, you can then write what we call a synopsis. So a synopsis is usually done for an area of conservation. So you've got conservation, you've got these different synopses that might be, for example, terrestrial mammals or marine mammals or forests or birds or amphibians, so on. And what you say is, okay, we're going to form a panel of experts and get them to write down a list, brainstorm a list of conservation actions that you could possibly do in the world. So they don't have to have been studied, they just have to be feasible. So they come up with this long list, and what we then do is we try and fit all the studies that we've got into those actions. So we go to the, for example, we go to the mammal folder, and we say, okay, that the experts have identified these actions. We put the studies, we fit those studies into the relevant actions, and a study might test multiple actions, so it might appear in multiple places as well. And the studies might also, when we look at them, actually not fit into any of the ones that have been identified, in which case we put a new action in to reflect that. And then what we do is we summarize the evidence for each of these actions. So the experts, or the researchers in the group will write a summary for every single study, and also key messages for the action overall. So saying how effective was this, how effective were, protecting elephants with poacher patrols in a protected area or something. That might be an action. And so what they do is they also write a summary of the evidence for that action. And the experts will also give it a effectiveness score as well. So they'll review the evidence and say, using a sort of standardized scoring system and scale, they'll say this action is likely to be beneficial or unlikely to be beneficial, or we're not sure because we don't have enough evidence, or maybe there's a trade-off between the benefits and harms. So there's various ways of scoring how effective it's likely to be based on that global evidence. And so it's quite impressive numbers when you think this has been done over the last over a decade now. So the team in conservation evidence have screened over 1.5 million papers. This is all manually. This has yielded about 8,700 thoroughly relevant studies now. We've also done it across different languages. So someone called Tatsuya Amano, who's now in Australia, helped us with, he runs the Translate project. So they've basically used our approach, but looked in non-English language journals as well. So we've also got a lot of the non-English language literature as well. And this has been, these studies test actions across, over 3,600 different actions that we've identified, some of which are studied, some of which aren't. And so this is, we've done lots of synopses now, so lots of different areas of conservation, from amphibians to farmland to bees, bats. Some of the distinctions are a bit strange, but that's partly because of funding and partly because of, particularly when people come to us and they want a review of a particular area done, they might be interested in specific parts of it. So at the moment, we've got someone working on an eel synopsis. So, you get some of these interesting areas that have been split out, but we've done quite a lot. We're moving towards almost doing all of conservation now. And I guess the thing to say as well, the advantage with our approach is that when we go to do a new area, we can look back in our literature-wide database and see whether we can just go back to that and see where the studies have been found. And we might add some specialist journals to that and do some more searches on top. But generally, we never really have to go back to a journal. That's the kind of principle of this approach. But obviously, it's very time-consuming. So we create these PDF documents for practitioners that summarize all the evidence, but we also do it on our website. So on the website, every single action can be found. You can go through and see what the evidence is, see how many studies have been done. So you can click on this, and I should have included another slide, but basically every single one of these actions that goes down the page will have a score based on the expert assessment. Inside it will also have a summary for every study. It will have a key message for that action, reviewing the evidence, and show where the studies have been done in the world on the map. So yeah, quite a comprehensive database that can be searched in different ways as well, looking at studies or looking in each synopsis if you want to do it that way as well. Now, I guess for this talk, the key issue that we've had, and this kind of where this project has come from that I'm talking about today, is that it's been such a slow process. We've had a massive team of postdocs basically working on this, which is quite mundane task as well. But they've only really able to add, particularly at the moment, with the team that we've got, we can only really add a few hundred papers every year. And obviously the scientific literature, the corpus is growing massively in that time. So we estimate that about 75 years of research and time has been put into this so far. So we're really at a point where we're struggling to keep up with the growth of the scientific literature, and obviously we think that AI and specifically large language models could really help us make our pipeline here much more efficient, and ultimately quicker. So I'm now gonna, I know Sadiq gave you last week a bit of a brief on primer on large language models. So I'm not going to go into very much detail on them, but I'm just going to mention a few key things that worth knowing if you didn't see that last week. One definition of large language models is that it's a model that's trained on massive amounts of text data, with the end of some kind of text generation. Sometimes it's not specifically text generation, but usually around this idea of tokens. And so there's lots of this is probably out of date now, but there's a huge diversity of large language models out there that is expanding every day. And you look and there's something new coming out. Fundamentally, what large language models are doing is what Gromit's doing here, and they're just trying to predict what the next word is or the next token is in a sequence. Obviously, it's a bit more complicated than that. They can look forwards and backwards a bit more now, but fundamentally, they're this is all they're really doing. And so, there's these principles of all the steps in the process of doing tokenization, embedding. So these tokens in a sentence, for example, can be split out. They're then embedded in a high dimensional space, given some semantic properties and concepts that you're interested in, and then they're used to then decide, which of these tokens is the most likely one in the next sequence. So there's different algorithms, I guess, for picking which word comes, which token comes next based on the weights. But generally, this is how large language models are working. They're trying to do this prediction. And of course, the big evolution, I guess, in LLMs is that these concepts of like attention and memory have really expanded recently and enabled them to get better and better at doing loads of really quite amazing generalization tasks. So the capabilities are quite impressive, but one big issue is, there are obviously massive shortcomings of LLMs, particularly given the principle of how they kind of work, this sort of prediction. So this is one really fun example of how LLMs can go badly wrong. So this, I don't know if you can see it very well, but this is what happens when you fine tune an LLM on Slack messages. So you said, write a 500-word blog post on prompt engineering. The LLM says, sure, I shall work it on in the morning. You said, write it now, and then it says, okay. So, I mean, this just kind of demonstrates also that the issue of data, what do you put in, garbage in, garbage out, what you put into the LLM will determine what comes out. So the data and the bias and the data you give to it is really important to bear in mind. And that's of particular importance when we're doing a project like this, evidence synthesis. Ultimately, we're trying to inform decision makers, so we need to be careful about what we're doing. But a more specific example, so my colleague Sam Reynolds, who works on this project too, put some queries into ChatGPT and said, can you give me 5 ways to help me prevent bats from collisions on roads? And so it gives you the usual churlish response of like, yeah, certainly, here you go. And gives you, some, on the face of it, reasonable, if quite generic recommendations. When you start to dig into it, we can look here, it gives an example of using back bridges, for example, which are real, but that you can then ask it, okay, can you give me references to publications that show that these back bridges are, work and are effective? What's the evidence for this? And so again, it will be like, certainly, here you go. Here's all the sources that I've found for this. The issue with this, of course, you can probably predict what I'm going to show now, is that this reference doesn't mention back bridges, this paper doesn't exist, this paper doesn't mention bridges, this one gets a bit closer, but it doesn't actually mention whether they work or not, and this paper also doesn't exist. So the overconfidence here, in particular, if decision makers are using something like this to inform what they're doing, they're already often overconfident, and this can even make the process worse. So there's part of this project is, and I'll talk about it later on a bit more, is this issue of how do you get something like this? How can you make something like this more credible and more evidence-based? And so for that example, if we went to the conservation evidence website, we can clearly see we haven't got many studies for this, so the effect's quite uncertain. But the experts their assessment of the evidence is that it's unlikely to be beneficial. And we see in practice, though, this is an example that's often held up in evidence-based conservation of why we need to do it, is that many councils in the UK have spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on these bridges without actually first understanding from past research whether they're likely to work or not. And so it might be fine to do some of these on a trial basis, but these have actually been rolled out in a much bigger way than you might expect based on what evidence we have.
I'm sorry, but why do you need a back bridge? I mean, I thought they could fly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they fly at a low level, so they get hit by the cars. So this is the aim of this back bridge, is to direct them up over the road along this structure to come down the other side safely.
Wait a minute, they're walking on the road,
No, the bats are flying.
but they have sonar, right? I mean, it's a.
Yeah, but it's directional, isn't it? I guess so. It's not. So the cars are coming. If they're flying like that,
But I mean, why would they fly on a wire?
exactly. So why do they think this is a good idea? I mean, they're being followed
It's a joke.
Yeah, I know. But then they've spent this amount of money on it. So it's quite.
This may be a Photoshop thing. It may not actually be true. I mean, I can't think of anybody.
Yeah, no.
Wikipedia disagrees. There's a lot.
There's some in Greater East Anglia. There's this one's in Cumbria. They're real.
Are those things blobs? Are those bats or?
No, these are like plastic. So I think they're plastic sort of structures. They're basically just to try and mimic. I guess they're trying to mimic a sort of hedge or a tree habitat. I guess for them to sort of fly along, as if because they often use those kind of pathways to for their routes. But yeah, no, it's dark, and this is the whole point of this, is that
It's cheaper than a tunnel. That's probably the main.
well, yeah, exactly, and underpasses and things, this is cheaper than doing that, I guess, and green bridges and things, but
Can
it's,
I, sorry, I just
yeah.
wanted to mention a thing. I'm trying to find a reference, and I can't find it, but there was a really cool study in the Turing where somebody looked at fictional literature
Okay.
of the 19th century in the Lake District and quantified, and they looked at some actual studies to verify that the people that describe plants were actually in fiction were actually quite accurate. So you could work out if the prevalence of different species of plant had changed over 100
Wow.
years. But when there wasn't much science literature,
Yes.
but there was enough to just check that it wasn't completely mad.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting, but I don't know what, I've just sent a message to some people, so I don't know what NLP techniques they use to do the analysis.
That'd be fine.
Because this is pre-LLMs.
Yes, of course, yeah. Okay.
It's quite interesting because also if you do get more precision in this, you can then extract that back into sort of free scientific, well, not free science, but yeah, a bunch of literature.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll be really interesting. Brilliant. Yeah, so yeah, back bridges, they're bad idea. Why did anyone even come up with this? So yeah, the whole point of that was just to say, kind of, obviously we've got a responsibility with these kinds of models. If we're going to use them for decision making or decision support and evidence synthesis, we need to make sure they're as good or, ideally better than a human if they were to do it. And that they're evidence based, they can show where they've got their evidence from, where the information is from, in terms of the responses they're giving. So I'm now going to talk about what we're planning to do in applying these large language models to the conservation evidence project and how we're trying to get around some of these shortcomings. So it's into 3 parts. So, and I've kind of structured it along this evidence pipeline. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to augment this pipeline at different stages with AI to not replace humans, but to enhance the efficiency of this workflow, I guess. So the first part of it is obviously this categorization or classification phase of how do you know, how do we know this study is relevant, and what is it looking at generally? What folder should we put it into? The next step is tagging that, once we know a study is relevant, tagging the information that's in it so that someone can then look at it and summarize it efficiently. And then finally is this decision support. So once you've got this database of evidence that you can update quickly, how do you then put an interface on the end of it that someone can interact with to get a good idea of what the evidence is quickly, but in a credible and reliable way, which is the challenge. So this first part, this categorization part, this is what we've mainly been working on at the moment. So Alec and also a student called Jamie have been working on this part of the pipeline. So again, this is just to emphasize, this is where we're trying to work out, is the study in a journal relevant? Is it quantitatively testing conservation action? And if so, which folder should we put it in? What's it looking at generally? So we can stop that pipeline. So what we're trying to do here, firstly to tackle this automatic categorization is that we obviously need study text. So we found that Crossref and something called this Open Alex database have got loads of metadata on about 250 million papers out there in the literature, which is a good starting point. And so what we want to do in this bit is to get an embedding model, which is a specific type of LLM that instead of generating text, it's going to generate this numerical representation of the paper. And basically produce this, which is a coordinate essentially in higher dimensional space, and essentially allow us to cluster papers that are related in these different semantical concepts that we can then fine tune as to which concepts we're interested in. And so Alec has helped us with this and embedded every title for every paper from those databases using 768 dimensions, and he's then transformed that down to just 2 and clustered at these 6 different depths. So this diagram that we're going, this visualization we're looking at, the green dots are studies that have been included in conservation evidence and the grey ones aren't. You can see with this is just a preliminary sort of stab at doing this, but you can see that we're going in and out at different depths of labeling into different sort of subfields of conservation. So this is just a first go at it, just using titles, which is obviously a very cool way of doing it. And what we're working on next is to look at accessing abstracts and full text of studies to do this ideally to do at least this stage at the abstract level, because that is commonly what a human would do. And so we've been working with the Office of Scholarly Communications, who's helped us make some really big strides in actually getting this data, because it's a real tricky issue of trying to actually get access to scientific literature to scrape it, essentially. Legally, it's quite a tricky area to navigate. Some publishers are really open and giving all their data, and some are a bit more maybe not unreasonably cautious in.
There was another project in Cambridge 10 years ago where, what's his name, Murray Rust, was a chemist, and he looked at toxicology and took all the American Chemical Society journals and took all the diagrams of chemicals and basically turned them into logical representations of the process. And they sued Cambridge for that and lost. Cambridge won, because you can't patent copyright the description of something that's in nature.
Yeah.
Well, the paper, the text of the paper is copyrightable, but the actual, so they made it as a precedent of that. And
yeah,
that was pretty cool. They basically created this toxicology. The idea was you get all these chemical things and then annotate all of them. So you can say, which one's in conflict.
Okay.
Do some cool things with that. Sure, that was a kind of project. And, yeah, ages ago.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, the main issue here is getting different publishers to whitelist an IP address basically that a machine can run on to then allow us to, most of them want to use us to use their APIs, but there's other issues of then what do you then use the data for? You know, this stuff is fine, but moving further down the line, when you get more towards the summarization of studies and things, that's where people start to get a bit junky, which is something we're definitely not doing. We're trying to avoid any sort of automatic classification. It's always going to be a human, which we'll talk about in the next step, doing the summarization.
Can I ask a quick question here on the
Yeah.
clustering? And are the cluster topics automatically generated, or was that just like
Yes.
you did the clustering and then
It's all
assigned
automatic.
topics?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, this is all done automatically at the moment. But it's something I imagine that what we'll do is there'll be, you know, in all parts of this, we're aiming to do human feedback, so trying to improve these models with members of the team looking at. So you know, the idea is to have this pipeline where there'll be a user interface for the researcher, so the researcher can obviously go in and check a certain subset or be able to ultimately go through and check and make sure that what it's tagging is relevant and the relevant are right. Obviously, we don't want to do that for the whole corpus because that would be ridiculous, but having some sort of threshold, and it's fine tuning that threshold, I guess, of what we include and exclude, and then having a human on the other end that can then sort of do a quality check and make sure it's we're not unreasonably excluding lots of studies that are actually relevant. That's the main thing we're trying to do here is get that balance right, I guess. So I'll just move on, just in the interest of time, I'll move on to the next stage. So once we've identified those relevant papers, we want to then move to looking into the paper and tagging the information that's relevant for us when we're doing our summarization. So yeah, just as a reminder, obviously, say we're looking at terrestrial mammals, we go to all the studies in that folder, and we've obviously split these out into the different actions they look at. And that part of this process will be looking at the studies and, you know, tagging with what action they're looking at, but also some other data which I'm going to show here. So this is the kind of summaries that we write for every study in conservation evidence database. So it's a structured format, obviously, to ensure that when humans are doing it, we can make sure we're doing it in a consistent way and do consistency checks. But this also lends itself really well to what we're trying to do here. So I mean, over time, we've kind of just realised we're just building basically a massive training data set to then, you know, do this kind of AI work, which is really cool. But this you can see, obviously, there are different parts of this summary that require different bits of information. So when the study was conducted, sort of a measure of kind of sample size or number of sites, the habitat, the region, intervention, lots of different aspects of the study's results and design. And so what we want to do for this part of the modelling process is to use this structured summary that we've got for all these studies in the database and break down, you know, what is the key information we want extracted automatically. And take a relevant paper and then get an extractor model to which will be fine-tuned to provide kind of the minimum amount of text from the study verbatim. So identifying where in the study are you most likely to find a particular bit of metadata, I guess. And it will then spit out the relevant bit of text, so literally lifted directly from the paper. And then it will send this to a summarizer model, and this will then tag that information using a structured format. So using this is the guide. And so what you can then do is once you've got that sort of tagged information and the text that you've got it from, is to present this to a researcher in a user interface and say, okay, we think the date is somewhere here, and this is what we think the date is. Can you check it, please? And so we can then have a researcher going through, and this is not going to. This is then tagging the study with this data. And that then means that a human can then come through and summarize that paper a lot quicker than if they had to search through manually themselves to do this. So we're not trying to we're not trying to generate an automatic summary here. We're trying to provide the researcher with the information they need to write the summary quicker, because I think ultimately it'd be slower to write the automatic summary and then get a researcher to edit that summary. It's often quicker to just give the researcher the information and then allow them to write the summary manually. We think that's probably where the efficiency lies here. And also legally, this is this fits in much more with what we're allowed to do with the publisher's data as well. And so in future work, I think it will also be interesting to try and look at, in terms of the information that you're tagging, to look at tagging study quality. So obviously, when we do evidence synthesis, things like risk of bias assessments are really important to critically appraise the quality of studies. And I think this is often a really slow part of the process as well, so trying to streamline this as well would be really useful. And so ultimately, these will always be manual quality assessments, but we could at least hopefully use AI models to maybe tag this information on quality more easily, so that we can get to an assessment of the study quality much quicker than we might otherwise do. And then finally, just the last part of the talk, I'm just going to talk briefly about how we're planning to, once you've got this living sort of pipeline and generating this living database of evidence, then how do you actually get a user to interact with it in a dynamic way rather than the static databases that we've got at the moment. So at the moment, if you want to interact with the data, the evidence, you can read one of the documents, the PDFs that we generate, these synopses with all the evidence summaries in, or you can go to the website. But we're kind of interested in how can we generate something called a conservation copilot that would essentially allow the user to interact with that evidence in a much more intuitive and dynamic way. So some of you may probably have no idea who this is, but this is clip from a long time ago. We're trying to do a conservation clipping. That's
horrible.
I like but so the idea here is, this is just something I mocked up, this isn't real, but this is potentially what a copilot might look like. So a user would come on and be able to ask questions, and the copilot would give a response and crucially show where the evidence has come from, where it is in the world, and use geospatial data to kind of rank the relevance of the evidence that it's giving to the user based on where the user's from. Because that's this customization aspect of conservation is quite important, because conservation is done in so many different contexts, different habitats. So we want to try and tailor outputs to different decision makers rather than giving a global answer, which might not be as useful. So just moving on, this is very early stages, as you can probably tell, but we're still thinking about how we're going to design this around the shortcomings of current LLMs, and also we've obviously got these issues of copyright and licensing of papers that we also need to navigate as well with how can we build something like this in a way that's legal in terms of the data that we're accessing. And I think a big part of that is using these human summaries that are, done manually but are AI assisted. So we're not actually using the AI model to summarize the study directly. We're just using it to help in that process. I mean, some questions I think we want to look at now, which doesn't really require building fine-tuning any, well, it does require fine-tuning some models, but wouldn't require that much work, is to first ask some practitioners about the questions they think they want answers to, so what they really want to know about in conservation right now. And then fine-tune some, LLMs that are, widely available at the moment, and fine-tune those on the Conservation Evidence website as we have it. So without waiting for this living database that we're trying to generate with all the other work I talked about, but just using what we've got at the moment. And then getting these practitioner questions, asking these fine-tuned LLMs and collecting the responses, and then giving them back to the practitioners and saying, okay, well, how useful was that response? But also getting researchers in our group to check, how accurate were those responses as well? Are they actually evidence-based? And then comparing those to different benchmarks. So maybe comparing to if a human was asked to do it, or if you've got a variety of different LLMs that you could compare it to. And I think this would help us also highlight some of those opportunities, but also pitfalls of using LLMs. Because something I'm quite worried about at the moment is that people are potentially going out there already and just using these LLMs out of the box without any thought about what the consequences are and how credible they are. So I'll kind of just to show kind of the ultimate vision here. We've got what I talked about in steps 2 and 3, this kind of AI assisted pipeline, and this idea of this co-pilot, which would be sort of fine-tuned ultimately on this living database of evidence that this would generate. But ideally, we also want to make sure we're checking the sources that are found in the co-pilot, the responses that are given and the sources that are quoted. We want to make sure those are actually verified and real. So we're in sort of preliminary conversations with Google DeepMind around whether we could potentially make a verification model to check whether the evidence that's being referenced in the co-pilot are actually real and whether they're accurately described and summarized. So having that kind of built-in quality checking going on there. But that's in very much early stages, idea phase at the moment. So I guess my take on all this, I kind of just mentioned it before, but I think decision makers are already using these things or will start using these natural language interfaces and chatbots like ChatGPT. So I think we need to provide a more credible interface for providing information on conservation actions and kind of get in there before it might be exploited for not necessarily for bad use, but just it might be used in a way that misinforms decision makers, which is really what we want to avoid, of course. So in conclusion, I think we can use AI particularly to speed up evidence synthesis, make it more efficient, but we need to carefully design how we're going to do that around the known shortcomings, particularly of LLMs that I've talked about. And I think ultimately the bottom line is that this idea of human in the loop, that we're always going to need a human somewhere in the process when using AI for synthesis and decision support. But the key is putting the human in the place where they can be the most useful, and the AI in the place that can make the whole workflow as efficient as possible while making sure it's still credible and reliable. That's the big challenge here. So that's everything I've got to talk about today. Thank you for listening. Happy to answer any questions you have about the project. Thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead, Emilia.
I was wondering about this always need a human in the loop element. Do you see that as being really because of these like copyright and kind of other people's work concerns, or do you see it as a fundamental limitation of the technology?
Kind of both, but also partly as a I guess safeguard. I think people won't use, well, they would use it if it didn't have a human in the loop, but in terms of the credibility and the sort of the scientific credibility around this, we need to, as scientists, I think we need to make sure that this is as rigorous as it can be, and the consequences of people using such a tool like this and then misinforming them, and the reputational damage that would have on not just obviously our project, but science in general, could be really quite catastrophic. So I think that's part of the reason for that as well, is that we have to be really careful with this, and also for this to take off and be credible, it also I think needs to have that safeguard built in and made quite clear. So yeah, I think it's the methodological concerns, and also the legality of it, though, is also another good reason for it. We need to have that sort of stopgap, I guess, in place, so that there's a clear distinction between what the data we're using from the studies, where that comes in, where it's used, and then where it ends, and then where human then takes over.
I've got a sort of supporting example. We did a project that just finished with the law department in Cambridge and some folks in Japan, where we were analysing not scientific evidence, but legal evidence. Actually, it wasn't evidence; it was court transcripts.
Okay.
And what we have is 30,000 court cases, which we built a language model of, not particularly LLM, but it's got a page towards that. LLMs have another meaning in law, but it's very confusing talking to lawyers. But what we wanted to do was to find out what cases had changed the interpretation of the actual law. So over here you've got all the definition of law, which in Japan is codified, in England's all precedents, which is not the court cases. And then you want to see where the cases are changed in interpretation. And what we did is we did exactly the same, having a human in the loop. Because while a language model trained on about legal documents might be able to spot sort of significant changes in language, it could just be because there's a non-native English speaker in the court case or whatever, it was some other thing. So what you do is you get the lawyers to eyeball the cases that are marked up and add extra labels to improve that precision. So I think but the other thing we did find is that specialized language, and this probably applies well for your biodiversity papers about whatever, it is much less prone to technical information. So if you train up a model on that, you know, we did, particularly, I think one of our guys in law tried, I think it must have been one of the early releases of the Llama, saying not GPT or whatever. And you've got very few made up stuff. They're pretty decent actually. So that sort of that suggests that's not going to be, you know, some problem. I mean, it remains to see, I guess,
exactly
about, but I think the human in the loop has this sort of has this other sort of double value, training people and giving the sort of confidence in some way. I mean, I think about authority to it.
Makes it more authoritative, I guess, in the eyes of who's using it at least. But I think you're right, and particularly conservation, I think is this. There's a lot of nuance as well, and particularly when we're looking at summarising studies. I think sort of vanilla LLM just going in and doing it is that even a fine-tuned one is not going to necessarily pick up a lot of nuances. So there's always, that's why I was saying in the summaries, just getting it to generate a summary, you might think, oh yeah, that's a really efficient way of doing it, but actually when you think about the time it then takes the human to read that and then edit it, be quicker for the human to just tag the information in the document and then get the human to write it from scratch. So that's kind of what we landed on. We think we're going to test that as well though, but I'm pretty sure that's going to be the way forward. And also legally that's the way forward as well. I should say, you know, we need that human written summary really to ensure that we're not just, you know, even though it's not the plan, we can reassure publishers that we're not taking their data and just summarising it and then spitting out for everyone to use.
There's also recent papers on taking LLMs, adding the 4 languages that have some semantics. You actually use old-fashioned NLP semantics as part of the system, and you can do that for artificial languages, programming languages as well. And it massively improves their precision as well.
Okay.
So it also allows you to potentially to quantify uncertainty. And the output potentially, I'm seeing a good result on that here, but that would be helpful.
That's really interesting.
We have a question online from Rosalind. Rosalind, could you please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hello. Are you concerned about the environmental implications of the computing power needed to run these large language models for climate change?
It's a good question. It's something we've definitely thought about. Obviously, we've got a responsibility to make sure this is as you know, low, you know, in terms of its carbon intensity is as low as possible, and we do this as efficiently as we can. So that's obviously, you know, a key part of every stage of this. We're trying to make sure we're using an LLM that is as simple as possible, that has as, you know, the smallest sort of computational requirements as possible, while still achieving a certain level of performance. So yeah, I mean, that is something that we can't get away from, I guess. But we hope that you know, ethically, that the impact this will have in terms of making conservation more efficient will kind of offset those the kind of carbon cost of and environmental costs of the energy use. But yeah, it's an important consideration in any sort of environmental research where you're using AI, definitely.
Tom?
I was wondering, the templates that you used to create the summary, did it work for negative results as well? So, for example, the authors found in the UK back bridges didn't work, or because it looked like it was just set up for positive results.
No, so it's very much set up for any result. Yeah. So I think that example might. Yeah, I'm not sure whether that had sort of an example text in it, but yeah, no, it's definitely, because we're trying to avoid publication bias there, so we really want to try and, we're interested in any result, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral. Yeah, something we need to probably look at then, just to check that that's not going to bias how we're doing this. But yeah, no, we definitely want to make sure that those summaries are in that format is agnostic of the result, the direction. Yeah.
Orlando, and then we.
Well, just a small thing to check. Your experts who produced the summary, you mentioned it was a load of postdocs working on that and a huge number of kind of career hours into that. Were it just postdocs or were there people from elsewhere, and how do you choose / kind of task someone to say, okay, your job is to basically look through these papers and create a summary?
Yeah, so it's been a series of postdocs, not just here, but also in other groups, and also in industry as well, so government and also government departments. So basically, if people want to review the evidence, usually the team employs a postdoc to create those summaries, to write a synopsis essentially. So that involves searching the journals, writing the summaries, writing the key messages and the overall synopsis of the evidence. So yeah, that is that's been one issue we talked about a bit, is also we want to make sure we're using human researchers in the most useful way possible, and this kind of it is quite grunt work in some ways of going through that when a postdoc is actually should be doing much more useful work. And so that's people keep saying, oh, you're going to put everyone out of a job in conservation evidence, but the whole idea is to actually say, no, you shouldn't be doing this. You should be doing this really useful, interesting stuff, not this. So particularly that stage of searching, anyway, for the studies, which is really quite laborious. We want to try and push people away from and get them into the more useful parts of this pipeline and reviewing the evidence.
Just going back to the idea of this conservation co-pilot, I think there's kind of an interesting benchmark here where you have this trade-off where obviously, even with the humans, postdocs, writing summaries, there's going to be some amount of error, but it's probably going to be quite low.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I'm guessing the error from something like a co-pilot, you have this trade-off of, okay, it's a lot more interactive, it's a lot more flexible, people can directly interact with it, but it's likely to have higher error and maybe substantially higher error. I wonder, have you guys thought about what's the trade-off there? What are you willing to kind of allow for? It's more interactive, it's better than the alternatives, things that aren't fine-tuned for these purposes, but it is sometimes going to give you nonsense or things that are not necessarily directly correct.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, and I think we don't really know the kind of threshold or the trade-off that we're willing to compromise on until we actually do it. And I think, obviously, if it was producing serious errors, then it can be used. But if it's it depends also who's exactly using it, because ideally there might be a situation where it's being used by someone that isn't necessarily, that has some that we kind of call them evidence bridges in conservation. So we're trying to get people that are working in conservation organisations or government whose job it is to look at the evidence. And so potentially someone like that would be interacting with this and be able to tell, speed up their workflow, but they would still be able to tell whether, potentially what it's giving you is, if it was clearly rubbish. I guess the situations where it gets more difficult is it's giving you something that looks really credible, but it might be slightly wrong. And it's, then finding out, where is the like you say, how wrong can it be before it's considered unacceptable?
And I wonder too, if you had this, kind of the mock-up on the side, it highlights particular papers.
Yeah,
And, I mean, obviously, once you hand it to a user, you can't force them to look at those papers,
No.
but ideally, you know, if it says something, they go, oh, it's really helpful, it's giving me an idea of what I should be thinking about.
yeah.
But then I also should go to those papers
Yeah,
and check
And I
myself.
think it would need a disclaimer definitely of like, you should then check these for yourself. This is a, starting point. I guess the issue we have in conservation is people don't have time. So whether they will actually do that, whether that's actually a safe assumption to say, oh, people will just go and check anyway. I think that is something we have to kind of contend with around this and see. I think that's the main thing we're trying to do, that co-pilot, is the feasibility of it really, and just saying, is this ultimately progressing this? Is this a good idea? Is what we're going to produce at the end going to be usable, or is it going to be credible enough to use? I guess the one issue is kind of like I was saying earlier, if people are going to be using these anyway, is it worth creating something like this anyway, even if it still has some errors in it? Is that going to be better than just saying no, we're not going to produce anything that people thought, and just access ChatGPT themselves and use that instead? So yeah, there's a lot of ethical questions I think around that, and where do you draw the line? What's the threshold you use? So something we're still thinking about a lot. So yeah, it's a really good question. We need to really sort of get on top of that and decide how we're going to approach that.
Yeah, thanks, Dimitri. Let me ask the last question. So then, one of the things that when an expert reads a paper is that they can judge the quality of the work. Sometimes the paper, you look at it, it looks very good, but you get a pretty good gut feeling this is not very good work. It may not have good statistical evidence. It may be done in a slipshod manner. The writing may have, obvious errors and so on and so forth. When you are going to summarize that expert evidence or kind of quality determination is perhaps eliminated. I don't know whether it's there or not. And of course, it will be in the citations, here are the 3 papers that suggest, building bad bridges, but maybe all 3 of them are undergraduate research projects, which were done over 1 month and had really nothing very good behind them. How do you, since you have humans who are annotating these papers, are you proposing to, or shouldn't you be actually also having some level of subjective quality assessment?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that is definitely, in terms of creating the summaries, that's definitely something that's done. So the structured format, the manual summaries at the moment, someone will definitely go through and check the study design, but also know any clear issues with the paper that mean that maybe it can't be. If there was something really, really wrong with a paper, it probably wouldn't be included at all.
Okay.
But if there's a clear reason for it and it can be justified, but otherwise, usually there would be a note to say, that there's, this paper did not do this, or the study design was clearly lacking in this way. But like you say, if we then do this, do we lose kind of that component? So that's definitely something we need to make sure is included in it. And I think part of that is when we're creating this user interface for people to interact, for the researcher to look at the paper, this idea of almost having an overlay on the paper that the AI is just assisting you with reading the paper rather than it replacing. So it should hope, that's what we're hoping, is that it speeds up that review of the paper and allows the researcher to tag the information quicker, but it still would be give the researcher enough of an insight into the paper to check on the quality and things like that.
Yeah, you can use the AI as sort of augmented realities. You see the paper, but you're overlaying it with the sections highlighted or something like that.
Yeah.
But you can still assess the overall paper quality. But there should be a way to tag that in your
Exactly.
So that you can assess it and you can say this paper looks good. Whatever, give it a scale, from 1 to 10 on different qualities, the thoroughness of the review, whatever it is.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, we are out of time, but thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you.